Good evening. Welcome to Let's Talk with Tammy, brought to you by Beacon Resources. Beacon Resources is a comprehensive consulting company in working with individuals, businesses, schools, and government organizations. They have a 10-year-long track record in conducting seminars, workshops, and individual series on personal branding. For those of you who are tuning in for the first time, this show features personalities from all walks of life, sharing profound insights into relevant topics. I'm Tammy, your host, and my basis for the show has always been about sharing my personal journey to learn anything that piques my interest. So, for this evening's episode, we are going to be discussing about anxiety and how to manage it. And I'm absolutely delighted to have Dr. Joel Lau on the show with us.
Hello.
Good evening, Doctor.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for being here this evening. So I'm going to just introduce Dr. Joel a little bit for our viewers out there. So a little bit about Dr. Joel. He is a clinical psychologist and director at the Mind Psychological Services and Training, and an EXCO member of the Malaysian Society of Clinical Psychology. He specializes in cognitive behavioral therapy, and he works with wide range of clients to help them reach their goals. So when he's not splitting his time between managing a clinical team, supervising clinical interns, and working with clients, he loves his football and pizza.
That was dinner just then.
Okay. So before we start, I'd like to remind our viewers that this episode is currently live on Facebook and YouTube. And if you have any questions at all, feel free to drop them in the comment section, and I'll be sure to share them on screen for Doctor to answer. So, Doctor, yesterday when I was sharing this poster on my Instagram story, asking them to throw their question if they have any, I actually received a reply that said, "This episode is actually for you," as in for me.
Oh, okay.
So, so people tend to self-diagnose a lot these days, right? So, does
Yeah.
that mean that if you're constantly being anxious or
Hmm.
overthinking, does that mean that I have an anxiety disorder? How do we differentiate anxiety disorder with normal anxiety that we tend to have occasionally?
Yeah, I think, with the internet, with all the shows and the movies that we watch, I think it's very common that people see what they see online on screens and then they think that they
Mm,
have it as well, lah, right? I think for many, many people, the anxiety that they feel is actually relatively normal by and large,
mm-hmm,
lah. Can't speak for everybody, lah, right? And I think what makes it difficult is when they are faced with anxiety, on a daily basis, right? I think
right.
this happens usually when the source of the anxiety is something that cannot be easily removed or
Mm,
dealt with, right? For example,
mm,
lecturers, traffic jams, impending assignments and things like that, right?
mm,
So actually, normal kind of anxiety is just prolonged, right? But when we talk about the clinical aspects of anxiety, when it's a disorder, usually there are two things that occur, right? The anxiety that you that you're experiencing has
mm-hmm,
resulted in impairment in either your social or occupational functioning, right? So
right.
social functioning means your ability to socialize with friends, family members, or people around you, and things like that. And occupational means the work or studies that you're doing, right? So
Mm,
whenever the anxiety that you feel has come to a point where you can't go into socialize with people, you don't want to interact with people, you can't get your assignments or work done, then we're talking. Then at that point, like, it starts going to the clinical realm, where it might be a disorder, lah.
All right. So when you say you can't do things or you can't,
Mm.
do they feel crippled or they feel like, okay, they can't work on it? Or will
Yeah.
it manifest in some other ways? Like, you just do not feel enthusiastic over things on those
Mm.
things anymore.
Mm. So specifically for anxiety, and let's talk about general anxiety for now, lah, before we
Mm,
go to the
mm-hmm,
nuts and bolts of it, lah. Typically, the reasons why they can't engage in the social and occupational settings is because they feel that overwhelming sense of doom, catastrophic thoughts. For example, I can't do this. What if it's not good enough? For example, and things like that.
mm,
So those are the kinds of thought patterns that they would have, and those naturally and understandably will stop them from engaging in the activities that we do, lah, right? For the average person who doesn't have an anxiety disorder, despite the thoughts that they have, they can still power through and get it done, right? For example, if I want to ask someone out on a date, even though I'm super filled with anxiety, I can still say, hey, you know what, I'm going to bite the bullet, I'm going to go ask and see whether it works out or not. But someone with an anxiety disorder will say, yeah, heck no, I'm not going to go there. It's not happening. I'm not going to try it and see.
right. Okay. So you were saying earlier that you will start with the normal kind of anxiety disorder. So how many kinds of anxiety disorders are there?
Tons, right? So if you
Right.
so I'm going to get a bit geeky here for a little bit, okay?
Mm-hmm.
So as clinical psychologists, we use this book called the DSM. So it's the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Health Disorders, lah, right? It's
Right.
this thing as thick as your Camus Day One kind of thing, probably thicker.
Mm.
And in it is a compendium of all the different kinds of mental disorders that we have, or at least known to mankind, lah, in that sense, lah, right?
Mm.
So in it, anxiety is actually an umbrella diagnosis, meaning that there are multiple things under it, lah, right? So the one that we were talking about just now, the general anxiety, that's what we call generalized anxiety disorder, meaning
Mm.
that there is a pervasive fear about everything and anything, lah. So it's just generalized. That's why it's called generalized, right? Next to that would be a specific phobia. So things like fears of spiders, fear of elevators, for example, fear of COVID, things like that.
Mm.
So that's your specific phobias. Then the more Hollywood kind of disorders that you see a lot is the OCDs, right? So the one you see a lot in
Right.
TVs and movies and things like that.
Mm.
And then aside that as well as the PTSD, lah, where you see the depictions in war movies and things like that. So these are some examples of it, and the list is pretty extensive, lah, in terms of
Right.
the anxiety-based disorders, lah, right? So there are quite a
Mm.
few.
Oh, okay. That's new. I mean, okay, now that you mentioned it, and then I realized that, okay, all of it actually have the same kind of characteristic and same kind of underlying feeling. Because before this, I tend to think like, oh, phobia is phobia, PTSD is PTSD, and then
Yeah, yeah,
anxiety
yeah.
is just anxiety.
Right, right.
Okay, right. So how do we know that we may be, okay, earlier you said you have this social impairment and you cannot
Mm,
function properly. But
mm.
what other telltale signs, like, when do you think that, okay, I think there's something wrong?
Yep. So one thing about anxiety that might be different from other disorders like depression, for example, is that
Mm-hmm.
it's usually quite physical how you experience it, right? So
Right.
things like heart racing, palpitations, shallow breathing, things like that, sweaty palms and things like that. So you do feel it quite physically, lah, right? And
Mm.
oftentimes whenever someone with more, when we talk about anxiety disorder, lah, right? So it's a clinical problem. You do hear also reports that after the trigger event has passed or gone or left or whatever it is, right? They do feel very exhausted, right?
Mm-hmm.
So what happens is that the idea
Mm.
here is that when someone is anxious about something, the body goes into fight or flight mode, right? So and that's quite normal, lah, right? You see a threat,
Mm-hmm.
your body either wants to run away or fight it, lah. In either situation, your body prepares physically for an anticipation whether you're going to fight the bear or run away from the bear, right? And it's that anticipation, it's that priming lah, that your body goes through that makes your muscles all very tense up, you're very tired and things like that. So once the trigger leaves, it's not uncommon. Like you hear people saying things they got like shoulder pains, back pains, migraine, things like that. Lah. So you see a lot of
Mm.
more physical symptoms usually with anxiety. Lah.
Right. Would it manifest the same way for kids?
In some instances, yes, but so kids they have a few more unique characteristics. So some kids, when they are panicky or when they're anxious, you might see they have like weird bowel movements, right? So they might be
Mm.
having diarrhea and things like that.
Right.
Kids tend to be a bit more grumpy when they're anxious, and usually that's
Mm-hmm.
because especially if we're talking about young kids like 5, 6 years old, right? Their ability to express their emotions aren't fully developed yet, so they can't tell you I'm
Mm.
scared. They'll just act really frustrated and grumpy and throw a tantrum and things like that.
Right.
So, but you do still see the same kind of physical symptoms at times. So you might see
Mm-hmm.
them breathe really shallowly. They might you put your hand on their heart and it's beating faster than usual and things like that. Lah.
Okay.
So you do see the similarities there. Lah.
Right, right. Okay. So what about panic attacks? Are they the same as anxiety attacks?
Sort of, kind of, right? So the reason why I say that is because so generalized anxiety is when we anticipate something or in anticipation of something happening, we're very fearful, whether or not something's happening or not. So the reactions that we get, the physical reaction manifestations that we get, is based on that triggering event. Holidays. Sorry, not holidays. Exams, work, mother-in-laws, father-in-laws, that kind of thing. By the way, I love my mother-in-law, so just using an example, generalized example, lah, right? But with panic attack, it's a bit different. The manifestations can be similar. So usually with panic attacks, you do get the similar kind of physical reactions, right?
Right.
But the triggering event is quite specific. Okay,
Mm.
so anyone can have a panic attack. You, me, anyone can have a panic attack because we face something that's so overwhelming that we have a panic attack. And we
Right.
usually what happens is that we have all those physical symptoms and we get totally
Mm.
overwhelmed by it. It's not uncommon for you to hear people say things like, "Oh, I felt like I'm going to have a heart attack. I'm going to have a stroke. I'm going to pass out." And again, it's not uncommon for people to have a panic attack and then go to the ER for ECG or echo or whatever it is, to check and see whether it's healthy or not, because it can feel that intense.
Okay.
Now, a panic disorder happens when you have that first panic attack and then you start fearing or worrying that your next panic attack is going to come. Right? So that's
Right.
order. So it's almost like you are panicking about panic in a weird kind of way.
Mm.
So usually people with a panic disorder, they are super hyper vigilant about any bodily or symptoms or bodily changes that they go through. For example, if I walked up a flight of stairs, it's natural that my heart will race a bit faster and I'll breathe a bit faster, right? But for someone with a panic disorder, they'll immediately jump to, or their thoughts will jump to the fact that, oh no, I'm having another panic attack. I don't know what to do. And it's that cyclic fear that almost like a cycle of doom kind of thing, right? So I
Mm.
have symptoms, I'm afraid I'm going to have a panic attack. The more I'm afraid, the more I have the symptoms, and then it starts that death spiral, basically. And then they have the
Okay.
panic. Yeah.
Okay.
So the panic disorder is quite unique. It's the trigger is the panic itself. Like I don't want to have another panic attack, and in anticipation, I have my panic attack.
Okay. So I find that interesting because you said that they are just scared of the next episode.
Hmm.
That means they do not have a trigger for it, like external triggers.
The not necessarily. So that means if something scares them, so let's say
Mm.
they watch a ghost movie or whatever it is, and then there's a jump
Mm.
scare, and because of the jump scare, the heart starts beating faster. Then they might have a panic attack because of it. But the distinction here is that they are hyper aware about their own bodily function. So whatever it is that triggers the heart racing or the beating faster, right, that will trigger the next panic attack. As opposed
Right.
to GAD, for example, generalized anxiety disorder, then it's
Mhm.
more a situation based. It's something that worries them. And the palpitations and all that is an afterthought or the symptomatic of the thing that worries them.
Okay.
Mm.
So when it comes to anxiety attack, right?
Mm.
I mean, I think one of the main things people with anxiety would have is overthinking.
Mm. Yeah,
Because
definitely.
right? Because
Mm.
that's literally what's making you anxious because you start thinking about possible scenarios that might or might not happen.
Yeah. The what if scenarios,
So
right?
yeah, the what if
Mm.
scenarios. So before I even okay, let's say of course the best way would be to go and see a therapist. But if
Mm.
we were to look for ways to cope on our own,
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah.
what are the ways that we can
Mm.
look at?
So, like I said earlier on, one of the unique aspects of any most anxiety-based disorders is that it's quite physical in nature, lah. So you have all these
Mm-hmm.
bodily reactions, right? So we can actually tap into that to our advantage, lah. So, normal circumstance, we see something that's threatening, tigers, lions, lecturers, or whatever it is, right? Our mind anticipates or thinks that there's threat coming, there's danger coming, something bad's going to happen, and then our body reacts, normal reaction.
Right.
So what we can do is a set of like relaxation exercises, for example, to use that same connection in reverse, lah. So if we're able to calm our bodies down, right, it's almost like sending a message to our brain saying, "Hey, dude, calm down. Everything's okay. Don't worry about it." Right. So if you go on YouTube, for example, and you look for things like deep breathing exercises,
Mm-hmm.
progressive muscle relaxation, mindfulness techniques, grounding techniques. These are some really good go-to exercises that I use all the time for myself, for my clients, my kids.
Mm-hmm.
That's a good way. So at least on a symptomatic level, it's really helpful to help us manage the symptoms. Now, will this stop all your other anxiety situations or triggers to happen? No, it's not. But it will help with the
Mm.
symptoms. And if you look at
Right.
someone with a panic disorder, it's actually quite useful because that way, then I don't have to worry about my next panic attack.
Mm-mm-mm.
Dealing with the thoughts, on the other hand, can be a bit trickier, lah, right? So
Right.
you mentioned this now, working with a therapist is good because the therapist will give you different perspectives, different ways to manage it, and all that kind of stuff, which is great.
Mm.
If you want to do it on your own, you can. There's some good exercises that you can download where it's almost like a thought diary kind of thing. So you
Right.
write your initial thoughts, and then the diary will give you like certain reflective questions like, is it true? What's the evidence? Where they come from? And things like that, right?
Right.
So that could be a good way to help you break down those anxious thoughts that you have. Some people
Mm.
do well with it, some people don't. Some people need a bit of assistance, and that's where therapy can be helpful.
Mm. Because I think not a lot of people sometimes they're not self-aware,
Mm,
so they
mm,
don't even realize that they're overthinking sometimes until they
that's
tell
right.
it out to somebody, right?
Mm,
They
mm,
don't catch themselves overthinking or they don't catch themselves panicking. They
that's right.
are just going with with the thought process,
Yeah,
and then they spiral.
that's the bad thing about the human brain. We can imagine things like Wi-Fi and computers and StreamYard and things like that, which is fantastic. But it also means that when we have a fearful thought, it gets amplified a millionfold, which is not a great thing to do.
Right. Yes. Okay. So when okay, imagining a scenario that once we have tried all of this and I
Mm.
still feel like I need an external help, I would like to see a therapist.
Yep.
How would the process be? Like, you cannot just go to a therapist like, I think I have anxiety, because I think they would want to know you better, right?
Mm.
Or how would that work?
Actually, no. I think what you just said there was really what happens more often than not, right? So clients come in,
Right.
they
Okay.
call us up and say, "Hey, I think I've got anxiety. I don't know. I need help." And then that's where usually the most calls will start, lah, right? And then
Mm-hmm.
we'll do is we arrange a session, and when you come in for that session, for me as a clinical psychologist, we do something called intake session. So intake session is
Mm-hmm.
basically where I try and get to know you a little bit better, understand the parameters of what's going on, the historical artifacts, and all that kind of good stuff. And we start to
Mm-hmm.
build this idea of what how you're experiencing the panic or the anxiety and where it's coming from, like, at least put a finger on it, like, in that sense, and then from there we can come up with interventions, like, right?
Okay.
But that's for clinical psychologists, like. If you want to
Mm-hmm.
see a psychiatrist or for medication, that's also
Mm-hmm.
another fantastic route. Again, because of the physical nature of anxiety, a medication works actually quite quickly. Things like Xanax, for example, the effects time is probably like what, a couple of minutes, 20 minutes, half an hour, so it's really
Mm-hmm.
quick. Right? For that
Okay.
one, you probably need to see a GP for a referral letter if you're going to a government doctor. But if it's a private center, no issue. Like, just give them a call and you rock up and you should be good to go.
Right. At what point do you think like it would have to go to having to take medications?
So this is one of those things where it's either or kind of thing, whichever you
Right.
prefer, right? So if you
Mm.
look at WHO, World Health Organization guidelines, as well as the KKM guidelines, like Kementerian the Medicine, Kementerian Kesihatan Malaysia, right?
Mm-hmm.
Their guidelines both state that for depression and anxiety, right, the gold standard of treatment is a combination of medication and therapy at the same time, right?
Okay.
The idea being is that the medication will help manage the symptoms, and then the therapy will help
Mm.
you understand the underlying reasons for the anxiety, and we tackle that. Yeah.
Okay.
So that's the ideal, right? But practically, maybe in terms of time, it might not be suitable. In terms of finances, might not be suitable, and things like that. Then it boils down to how you want to try, right? And both comes with it pros and cons, right?
Okay.
With medication, like I mentioned just now, it's really quick, like 20, 30 minutes, and you pop the Xanax, you're done. For the next hour or two, the anxiety is there, but it's manageable, you're not afraid, and things like that. It's fantastic, right? But
Okay.
the issue with medication is that it doesn't tackle the underlying reason. That means that, for
Mm.
example, if I'm afraid of flying, right? Every time I take a flight, I have to take a Xanax, right? I have to, because there's no other way to go about it or deal with it, right? So that's the issue. You have a dependence on it almost, and also your body develops a reliance on it, like, eventually, right?
Mm.
Now, therapy, on the other hand, of course, it takes longer. On
Okay.
average, for, let's say, a standard case of anxiety, we're looking at about 6 to 8 sessions on average, right? So it takes a while, right? But the idea here is that once you go through the whole protocol of, let's say, CBT, cognitive behavior therapy, or whatever it is that you're going for, you'll be equipped to handle most situations, and you don't have to keep going back, right? So, like, one of the things that I
Mm.
tell my clients is that I hope I never have to see you again, in the best of reasons, because I hope that I've equipped you enough that you don't have to come back. You're ready to rock and roll on your own. You don't need to come back for follow-up stuff.
Okay. Mm. So could you elaborate a little bit more about what cognitive behavioral therapy is?
Yeah, sure. That's my baby. I love it, right?
Mm-hmm.
So CBT stands for cognitive behavior therapy, and the premise of it is quite simple, right? The phrase that I usually use is I think, therefore I am, right? So
Mm.
CBT argues is that we are who we are is because of the thoughts and beliefs that we have, lah, and everything else that we encounter in this world is neither good nor bad, happy nor sad. It is what it is because of the way we see it, lah, right? So, for
Mm.
example, if I ask you, is getting a promotion a good thing or a bad thing? What do you think your response would be?
Definitely a good thing.
Okay, more money, more recognition, all the kind of
Yeah.
fantastic, right? Maybe
Mm-hmm.
nicer office as well. Can it be a bad thing?
It could be a bad thing, depending. I mean, you get more stress, there's a bigger responsibility for you and things like that. Yeah.
Exactly right. Exactly right. Another good example would be having a baby in the family, right? Again, by and large, it's a good thing. Happy, everyone celebrates, people are happy about it. But the 4 o'clock diaper changes,
Yeah.
mysterious cryings and all that, we have no idea what's going on, right?
Yes.
So that's the thing. So I guess with these two examples, what I'm trying to highlight here is that the situations remain the same. It doesn't change. It's a promotion. It's having a
Right.
baby, but
True.
it's our experience of it, our interpretation of those events that make it good or bad, happy or sad, right?
Mm.
So CBT taps on that whole idea, right? Something that's anxiety provoking, let's say an exam, right? If you are not prepared, if you think that you're going to fail, if you inherently feel that you're not good enough to complete the exam, then
Mm.
naturally you feel with lots of anxiety. But if you studied really well, you prepared for it, you know the content, and you know that, hey, you know what, it's a university degree. I don't not so worried about the grades. I just want to pass. Then
Right.
suddenly you can manage anxiety to a point where it doesn't cause much anxiety anymore, right?
Mm.
That's
Mm-hmm.
basically the premise of CBT. We try to manage the thoughts that you have or provide you different ways to think about a situation so that it
Mm-hmm.
doesn't become so overwhelming or so unbearable anymore.
Right. Okay. I think I have a perfect question, a follow-up question from a viewer because we were
Yeah.
just talking about the example. So this is basically from my colleague, Dr. Umar.
Okay.
So, hi, Dr. Joel. What strategy or advice you would give to students who tend to experience exam test anxiety? As a
Mm.
lecturer, we frequently come across students with this issue and want to help them in the best way. Thank you.
Yep, good. That's a fantastic question. Very practical and good
Mm.
for a lot of students out there as well. So for this one, I would probably recommend two pathways, lah, right? So with CBT, just now the things I mentioned just now is the cognitive aspect of it, lah, and that really forms the backbone of CBT therapy, lah, right?
Mm-hmm.
But there is the other part as well, the behavioral part. So I'll start with this one first for Uma, right? So what I
Mm-hmm.
would recommend is that, or what I would suggest is that, you know how when kids go for exams, especially when they don't haven't had very much experience doing this kind of exams, right? It's that fear of doing the exam that is the problem. Not so much that you don't know the content or whatever it is. It's just because I've not done it before, right? It's almost like driving a car. You know, the first time, Tammy, you drove a car, I'm sure you're like, oh my god, what's going on? There's a mirror here, there's a mirror there, there's so many pedals, what's happening, right?
Yeah.
But you know, after what 5 years, 10 years of driving, you can eat lah, sing a song lah, put on your makeup lah. It doesn't matter. It's fine. It's almost
Mm.
automatic in that sense. So behaviorally, for kids who are anxious about exams, one thing we could do is to try and simulate exam situations or scenarios. So put them through like a mock exam kind of thing and make it as real as possible to get them used to at least the mechanics of having the exam. So that can be helpful, right? So that's the behavioral part. In terms of the cognitive part, typically when someone is overwhelmed with anxiety, there's a reason why. Is it because they don't want to disappoint themselves, disappoint their parents, they don't want to embarrass themselves in front of their friends and things like that, they don't want to get laughed at and things like that, right? So usually there's this underlying reason why it's happening. So maybe
Mm-hmm.
that's something that you can spark an inquisition in your students, lah, right? Ask them and see lah, why are you really so afraid of exams? Even if you fail, so what? What's the worst case scenario? What's gonna happen to you? And I think oftentimes having that knowledge on why it's so scary can be quite useful because then you can make a decision like, is it really worth being so scared? Right? For
Mm.
example, a student says, oh, I don't want to disappoint my parents because if I fail, it means they'll be disappointed in me. And if they once they realize that and they ask themselves, hey, I failed so many times before, mom and dad still love me, they still take care of me, and they still encourage me. So maybe it's not so worrying, maybe. So that's one way we can go about it in that sense, to try and
Mm.
reduce the anxiety for exams.
Okay. So following that, right, let's say, for example, because you're talking about the basis of CBT is by telling
Mm.
them that every single situation has its good and its bad. It's just how
Yeah,
we view it, right?
that's right.
So what if it is something that, I mean, obviously it's going to be bad. Like, what
Mm.
if someone comes to you saying that they're just very anxious thinking about the impending death of a loved one?
Yeah, yeah, I think that's a fair one as well. So another good example would be people who come from abusive families. There really isn't a good thing about it, and I think that's exactly right as well. Now, your example was there's someone who's going to pass away, so maybe through chronic disease or whatever it is, and I get that. You know, it is a bad situation or a bad scenario, lah, right? But that's again one perspective about it. If you think about it, if this person has been sick for a very long time, the quality of life
Mm-hmm.
has diminished to a point where they can't take care of themselves, they need assisted living and things like that. Perhaps them passing on might be a kindness to them in that sense, right? And
Mm.
also be focusing on not so much on the fact that he or she is going to leave us, but the life that they've led, the life that they've had with you, would be a different way to
Mm.
look at it. So then it's a celebration of life instead of fearing impending death, right? Same
Mm.
goes with abusive families as well. You have, let's say, two kids, one abusive father, for example. One kid might have the impression that, dad beats me up because I'm useless, I'm horrible, he doesn't love me, and things like that, and then grows up with a lot of anxiety. The other kid thinks, no, that's being a very mean person, is horrible person, and I don't like what he's doing to me. I'm going to be better than that. And then he doesn't become a bully himself and much more confident and things like that. So
Mm.
even if it's an inherently horrible situation, right? I think it's not so much about looking at good and bad. It's about functional, not functional sometimes, right? So that's what we
Mm.
try and do for our clients.
Okay. Right. And in your practice, doctor, have you noticed if the number of people coming with anxiety increasing over the years or things like that?
I think during this COVID period, we have seen a general uptick in sessions throughout, generally speaking, not just anxiety. So people coming for
Mm.
depression, couple issues, things like that. But what we did see was that when the borders started opening up, when some people started going back to the office, you did see a lot more spikes in people coming for worrying about COVID, going out in the open again, bringing COVID back home and things like that. So that one we did see quite a bit, right? And it's
Mm-hmm.
understandable. I think You know how when two is it 2 years ago? I can't remember how long. When we first went to lockdown, right? Whenever it was lah, it took us all quite a while to get used to working from home, staying home, don't go
Yeah.
out, that kind of thing, right? Now after 2 years, just to go back out again, it's very normal that you are filled with anxiety because it's like, oh,
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how it's like anymore. I don't know how to drive anymore. I don't know where to go,
Mm-hmm.
where to park my car. So it's normal lah, that there's uptick lah, right? But I think my suspicion is that given enough time, it'll balance back out into the normal numbers again lah, I think.
Right, right. Also, do you think the awareness is also there, to seek help if they feel like they are not feeling okay?
Oh yeah, I think especially in the past 2 years where there's been a really strong voice lah, of people talking about mental health, advocating for good
Mm,
mental health and things like that. And even in my line of work, you do see a lot more companies who are reaching out for like corporate level programs for their employees and things
right.
like that. So I think in terms of the awareness lah, about disorders and treatment, it's still relatively low. But I think people are having more conversations about it. People are asking
Mm,
questions, which is fantastic, right? Because I think the more you talk about it, like conversations like this, for example, things on radio, things we see on the TV, even shows that are dramatized, like that one on Netflix, was it 13 Reasons Why, right? There was a lot of controversy about it. They say they glorified and suicide and things like that. And yeah, I agree with that. But that
mm-hmm.
also meant that a lot of people are talking more about suicide. A lot of people got more information about suicide. And for me, that's
Mm,
not a bad thing at all. So I think that's
right.
why it's been really, really helpful, I think, for the feel and for people as in general. The more they know, the more they can get help for it.
Okay, okay. So when it comes to the second part, I think I've been reading a lot about this because I've been very intrigued by this term called high functioning anxiety.
Mm, 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 mm.
But apparently, based on my reading, it's not an official diagnosis yet.
Yeah,
Is it
yeah,
true?
correct. Yeah.
Okay.
So when we talk about disorders, so there's high functioning anxiety, there's high functioning depression as well. These are two
Mm,
more common, popular, more widely spoken about ones, right? They're not classified as a disorder proper because the DSM I mentioned is that it typically focuses on the more clinical aspects, the more detrimental aspects of things, right? Now, with high functioning anxiety, what happens is that, or what's happening on paper at least, is that if I give this person with an anxiety assessment, they will meet
mm-hmm,
all the criteria. The results will tell you that, hey, I have anxiety. But what happens is that this person's ability to cope, to function, to put on a mask even, is so impressively strong that when they go and engage people and do things that they do, it's not being exhibited. So you don't see it. So these people, they look calm, they look okay, and all that kind of things. But the instant everyone goes away, they go back home, then they just crumble, right? Because that's
yep.
when they're able to release, so to speak, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's what you call high function anxiety. They are anxious. It's just that they can masquerade it or cover it up very well.
Okay. So for me, I think that is a very exhausting
It is.
process,
It is. Yeah, correct.
right? So
Yeah.
how would you suggest people like this to, what can they do to reduce a bit of that burden?
I think not only exhausting, I think a lot of times the repercussions of it can be quite much greater as well. Because if you see someone who's visibly anxious, then you can say, "Hey, can I help? Is there anything I can do?" Or someone who is putting on a mask, for example, you can't see it. That means they really have to rely on their own. So I think
Yeah.
therein that's the answer to your question. I think if you are someone who is constantly anxious, but you're putting up a front, you're trying to put on a brave face and not try to do anything about it, the best thing you can do is just put your hand up and say, "Hey, I need help," right? Because with therapy, I think one of the things about therapy is the idea of volition, right? Therapy only works when you want to change. So that's why when
Mm,
we get parents or family members who drag their couple, their kids or their partners or whatever it is to therapy, it doesn't work out. I'll stare at them for an hour, they'll stare at me an hour, and nothing happens, right?
mm-hmm.
So when you're able to put your hand up and say, "Hey, I've got an issue, I need help," I think that's really helpful, right? And that really kickstarts the whole journey of your mental health journey to get you back on your feet.
Okay. Now I'm just suddenly thought of this question. Earlier you're talking about because I'm very interested with CBT now. But how do you use CBT for phobias?
A few ways, right? So with
Okay.
phobia, again, fundamentally, it's irrational, excessive fear about something, right? So
Mm,
spiders, heights, planes, what have you, like that sense, right? So underlying that, from a cognitive perspective, is really about trying to see why that thing is so scary. Is it because you're
mm-hmm.
afraid of? Are you afraid that you cannot take care of yourself? Are you afraid that you're going to be ridiculed for having that thing on you or experiencing that thing, whatever it is, right? So that's
Mm-hmm.
one aspect of how we tackle it, lah. So like I said, it's not changing perspectives. Now, specific to phobias, we have something called a fear ladder, and that's something that we do, right? So, fear ladder basically is literally what it means, lah, right? So, we have this step by step kind of thing to reach to that final fear, right?
Okay.
So, for example, if someone's afraid of lizards, you know how in Malaysia we all those get lizards running around, right? A fear ladder could be that at the very peak of the ladder would be the actual lizard itself, lah, right? So, the first step would be maybe a description of the lizard. It's brown, it's scaly, you touch its skin, it's cold, you know, things like that. Second one would be seeing a picture of it, right? Third one will be watching a video. Fourth one will
Mm-hmm.
be see a lizard in a glass box or whatever it is. Fifth one is seeing one running around, and the final step would be the whole one in your hand, right?
Okay.
And the idea here is that by going at it at step by step kind of a process, right? What we're able to do is to introduce the fear factor bit by bit. But at the same time, at every step of the way, the therapist will be with you to help you manage your anxiety. Lah. So we'll be saying, okay, do your breathing, what are the thoughts that are going through your head, and help them process that kind of information. So it's a gradual process, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, the other more controversial but more fascinating way of doing it is called flooding, right? Flooding, again, is very literal. So let's say, for example, you're afraid of dogs, right? Flooding will
Mm-hmm.
basically entail me saying, okay, this is deep breathing. This is how you do your relaxation exercises. This is what you do. Now we're going to do flooding. I'm going to put you in a room, throw 20 dogs inside, lock the door, all right?
Wow. Okay.
And that one is controversial because, you know, it's some people say it's inhumane and things like that. Yeah, I get where it's coming from. Lah. But if you're being really objective about it, the reason why that helps is because you know how when we experience fear, right? What happens is that okay, I don't have a pen and paper, you know, but what happens is that when you have experienced something that's fearful, like a dog or whatever it is, right? Our fear spikes, okay?
Mm-hmm.
But in most situations, right, either through being accustomed to the dog, either the dog, maybe the dog walks away, or the dog, or you chase the dog away, the fear naturally comes back down again. So you have the full experience. I'm afraid
Mm-hmm.
of dog, and then the fear comes back down again. Full experience, right? For someone who has a phobia of dogs, what's going to happen is that they see the dog, the fear spikes, and then they run away. They leave straight away. That means they never have the full experience. So it's almost like they
Right.
peak, drop. They don't
Mm.
have the full gradual experience. And what happens is that engenders a situation where I see dog, I only have fear. That's it, full stop.
Mm.
Flooding does is basically forces that person to stay in that zone until they can have the full experience. So usually
Right.
we'll ask them to stay there until they are calm, they relax. It's like, okay, it's a dog, like no issue anymore. But again,
Okay.
I say like it's more controversial and it's not something you should do without assistance, lah. So please don't, even though it's fascinating, but don't lah.
Mm-mm-mm. Okay. Wow. Okay. This really brought back a memory. When I was a kid,
Yeah.
I don't know why. I think it was through some conversation. I remember watching. I think I was about 9 or 10 years old, and I was watching the news, and they were
Mm,
talking about some typhoon or something like that,
mm,
and so I saw roofs flying off in some
yeah.
country. So ever since then, I've had this very irrational fear of rains back then.
Mm, 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 mm.
So every single time when it's going to rain or when it's raining heavily, I'll have a full-on meltdown.
Right,
And
right.
it's just that was the fear, right? And then while you were
Mm, mm,
saying, then there was this one time where I had to be in a different school. I was outside in a different school for a competition or something, and it was going to rain. It was dark, it
mm,
was going to rain.
right,
I knew
right.
that I should not cry here because I don't want to embarrass myself.
Yep.
So that was the point where I had to hold myself together
Right,
and not
right, right.
cry.
Yeah, yeah.
And then it was over. After that,
Right.
I stopped having that, meltdown anymore
Fantastic. So
because
you
I knew I could do one time, I could do it again.
right. You flooded yourself basically. Good job. Nicely
Yeah,
done.
yeah. Right. Okay, this is another question.
Yeah.
Okay, so is it normal? So this is another colleague of mine. I have a lot of colleagues who are very caring and asking a lot of questions about their students. Is it normal for a person to feel anxious when
Uh-huh.
they need to meet expectations, especially among students? And how can
Okay.
they overcome this?
Yeah, you know, the human condition is that, you know, we are built to try and impress, to meet
Mm,
expectations. And you think about it from an evolutionary perspective, it makes a lot of sense. Like, you know, my expectation is that I need to put food on the table, I need to go find food. I need to build a house, I need to build a house, because if not, then we won't survive. Lah. So from that perspective, it makes a lot of sense, lah, right? So I think the anxiety for meeting this kind of expectations, it's actually a good thing. Like what you said earlier on, you are someone who is driven by anxiety to perform, right? So
mm,
again, it's like fire, lah. You know, fire can be used for good and bad, lah, in that sense, lah.
yeah.
So I think having some anxiety for expectations is good because it helps the student feel prepared, saying, okay, I need to study harder for this, I need to prepare for this, do a good job.
Yeah.
Yes. The problem arises again, like I said just now. It's a question of magnitude, right? When it
Mm.
overwhelms them, when they cannot eat, when they cannot do anything else but worry about what's going on, when it causes them to shut down, means I can't study anymore or prepare for my exam or whatever it is that they're doing, then it's an issue, then it's a problem, right? And that's when it becomes a situation that we need to handle in that sense, right? Now, in
Mm-hmm.
terms of how to handle it, I think the behavioral stuff that I mentioned just then about like deep breathing exercises, grounded techniques, and all that, those would be really good to help on the symptomatic level. On the
Mm-hmm.
cognitive level, on the psychological level, I think what's important is for the student to ask themselves that, how come, right? Simple, really simple question, right? If let's say it's Joel and Tammy are doing the same assignment, Tammy is rocking it, no problem at all. Joel is just paralyzed with fear. What's the difference between Tammy and I, right?
Mm.
Maybe Tammy's a better student. Okay, fine. But does that mean that I cannot study a bit harder or read a bit more to try and make up for it? Maybe I can, right? I can try that and see, right? So
Yeah.
by breaking it down that way and not letting that fear just exist as the fear, we break it down a little bit, suddenly it becomes a lot more manageable, right? So it's
Mm.
more like one of those you know how when you watch ghost movies like I don't know, The Exorcist and things like that, when you first watch the
Mm-hmm.
movie it just completely paralyzes you. It's so frightful, right?
Yeah.
One really good tip you I can give you guys to not be afraid of the ghost movies after you've seen it, right? Because obviously you dream about it and think about it, right? Is to go and watch the blooper reel or the behind the scenes kind of thing. Because
Yeah.
once you see that the ghost is literally a silicon puppet with some guy's hand behind it and things like that, then you're
Mm-hmm.
like, why am I scared about this anymore, right?
Right.
The same
Right.
technique, the same idea behind the managing of this anxiety, basically. When I
Mm.
deconstruct the anxiety and I make sense of it, and suddenly it's like, oh, why am I afraid of this? It's not that
Mm.
frightful, I can manage it. Then it goes away.
Okay. Okay. You brought another important point. I see a lot of things, people, a lot of points and a lot of things where they talk about, don't rationalize your thoughts. Feel it. So, what's your opinion on that?
I think there is a place and time, right? I
Mm.
think there are times when people over rationalize the situation or the emotions, meaning that you want to be happy, you're in love, you're angry, you just want to experience it as much as you can. And sometimes I think
Right.
that can be really useful, right?
Mm-hmm.
Usually, when someone rationalizes an emotional situation, it happens because they are afraid of the repercussions, right? Let's say you
Mm.
fall in love with someone, but you're not sure whether you're ready to be in love yet. Then you
Right.
over rationalize it, like, oh, I'm not ready. I just got out of a relationship. This person is someone I just met. Might not be right for me. So you over rationalize it. But
Mm-hmm.
again, what's the intention behind that over rationalizing? Over rationalization. It's a protective kind of thing, right? So in those kind of situations, it's bad. But in other times where you're totally consumed by your emotions, by fear, by anxiety, and things like that, to a point where you're not able to function, then in those
Mm-hmm.
instances, I think it's a really good situation for you to over rationalize it, because then you can
Mm.
break it down, make
Mm-hmm.
it more functional and adaptable. So I think it's a causes for causes kind of thing. When the right situation
Mm.
arises, then you do the right thing.
Okay. And what about people who struggle with intrusive thoughts?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting one as well, right? And that
Mm.
usually, when we talk about intrusive thoughts, the population that experiences the most usually it would be the people suffering from OCD, lah, right?
Mm.
So again, let me get a bit geeky here a bit. OCD is obsessive compulsive disorder. So there are two components to it, lah, right? You've got the obsessive part and then the compulsive part, right? The ones that we see on TV and the more well-known manifestations of compulsions are the physical acts, like washing your hands, showering, counting the lights or cracks on the floor and things like that. Those are
Right.
compulsions. And we typically, people with OCD typically engage in the compulsions because it helps soothe their fears, lah, which is basically the obsessions, lah, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, the unique thing about people with OCD is that the obsessions that they have and the things that they're afraid about, right? When you ask them, when you try and rationalize with them, right, about why they have it and whether it's valid at the point or not, right, they'll tell you, no, it's not valid. It doesn't make sense. I don't know why it's coming in. So that's what we call intrusive thought. Lah. In spite
Mm.
of not wanting it to be there or knowing that it doesn't make sense, it still keeps coming into our head. For most of us, when we have those kind of intrusive thoughts, we can just say, shush it, go away, and it's fine. People with OCD, they can't. So they have to use the compulsions to try and manage it or quiet down those noises or those voices, like, in that sense. Right? So that's an
Mm.
interesting thought.
Okay. Okay. I think I want to go to social media because I think social
Mm.
media plays a huge part, right, in anxiety,
Oh,
especially among the kids, youngsters,
oh,
where you
mm.
constantly have to, you can't help but to compare yourself and you see things online,
Right.
things like that. So how do we manage that? How do we
Mm.
manage this social media consumption so it doesn't affect your mental health as much?
It's hard. I think the intuitive approach for a lot of people is, if social media makes me anxious, then I go away from social media lah, right? Which,
Yeah.
yeah, it makes sense, but is it practical? Is it feasible? Not really. We
Mm.
all of this, especially during lockdown, lah, our lives literally was on our phones and on social media and things like that, lah, right?
Yeah.
So I think instead of trying to go that cold turkey approach, which, to be fair, in certain circumstances might be quite useful. So you do the whole digital detox kind of thing for a couple of hours a day. That's not a bad thing. It should be, everyone should try that out every now and then and see, lah, right? But I think more feasibly, like, what we can do is, again, to understand where the anxiety is coming from. And you see me going back to this theme a lot, and that's the whole premise of
Yes.
CBT, basically, right?
Mm.
So if you go on Instagram, for example, you're scrolling through the post and you see, oh, look, another person has started a business, another person has gotten their first car, their first homes, and things like that. And I'm here in my parents' house, eating their food, that kind of thing, right? And if you know that that kind of post causes you anxiety, right? Again, try and understand where that's coming from. Is it because you think
Mm.
that you are inadequate if you compare to them? Is it because you think that I could be doing better, I should be doing better, and I feel like a failure, for example, and things like that. So again,
Mm.
if you deconstruct that anxiety that you're feeling, then you probably get to the root of why it's there in the first place, right?
Okay.
Um, some other people, what they will do is that they will go ahead and block those kind of posts, right? Which it can help as well, also out of sight, out of mind. But don't forget, if you do that, it's very band-aidy. It's like putting a band-aid over a wound, right? You don't see it, you don't feel anxiety, but whenever you do, it's going to come racing back again. So that's going to be an
Yeah.
issue.
Yep. I think another part about social media is, okay, let me see if I can articulate this properly. It creates a silo, right? It's an echo
Mm.
chamber. So, for
Yeah, yeah.
example, I follow a couple of pages and memes
Mm.
that basically reinforces what I feel. Let's say, for
Right.
example, I'm one of those people, like, after an interaction, I go home and I'll think about it. I'll end up
Mm.
thinking about, what did I say? Did I say things correctly? What is that person going to think about me now? And
Right.
I wouldn't even realize that what I'm feeling right now is not normal
Mm,
because
mm,
it's
mm.
being normalized.
Right.
You see
That's,
memes out of it. People make things like, oh, everyone is feeling the same way, until you realize actually that's not normal.
mm, mm. That's right.
Thinking about what you've just spoken, or you start getting
Mm.
anxious just because people are not replying as soon enough.
Yep.
Those are things that people make meme out of because they
Mm,
also
mm.
feel the same.
Right.
But the point that you feel like, oh, do I really have to go see a therapist for this? Everyone is feeling the same way as me.
Mm, mm, mm.
So how do we know? How do we recognize? Okay, this is actually not normal behavior simply because it's on social media everywhere.
Yeah, it's hard, lah. And I think also with social media, like you said, like echo chamber, lah, right? Like, for
Mm.
example, conspiracy theorists, right? A lot of conspiracy theories out there are conspiracy theories for a reason, lah, in that sense, lah, right?
Mm-hmm.
But now what was going to happen is that, if you join a group with similarly like-minded kind of people, lah, for example, if they all believe that in the flying spaghetti monster, which is, I think, a religion in America, if I'm not mistaken, lah, right?
Mm-hmm.
Then if you spend all your time with believers of that religion, then there is no reason for you to discount it, lah, right?
Yeah.
I think for this kind of situation, the first step is really about realization, lah, that perhaps there's
Mm.
something wrong, right? If you only feel comfortable within a small group of people online, right, when you do whatever activity they're doing, like the overthinking,
Right.
for example, then it's probably a good indication. And let me backtrack a bit. And if in other situations you're doing it and you feel uncomfortable, or people call you out on it, it's probably a good indication that something is wrong, or something is awry.
Mm.
I don't know what it
Mm.
is, but you can find out, in that sense. So that's how we typically go about doing that. If it's something that is inconsistent, that means only in one situation I feel okay, every other situation I'm not, potentially there could be something wrong. Now I
Mm.
say potentially because there are times also where it's expected, it's understandable, right? For example, if I'm really, really into Care Bear teddy bears, for example, like really into it, right? And I can understand that for a adult male, society would say that, hey, that's not encouraged or appropriate, in that sense. So that's why I feel comfortable in my circles. Everyone out there who is into Care Bear teddy bears, don't get nothing wrong, or more power to you. My daughter loves them, so that's why I use them, for example.
Mm-hmm.
So it's consistency. I think if it's something that's inconsistent, it's incongruent, then potentially there's something going on and it's worth exploring and seeing.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I guess at the end of the day, just because everyone feels the same as you doesn't, the fact that you are actually feeling uncomfortable is still there,
Yes, correct.
right? So, and you need to recognize that at the end of the day, you are feeling uncomfortable. You're not feeling happy about it. You're still thinking about it. So I guess there's something wrong. Just
That's right.
because everyone else is feeling the same doesn't mean it is normalized.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's exactly right.
Okay. And I think another thing I would like to talk about is the fact that these days, I guess, is the work culture.
Mm.
Like conversations around work sometimes, if people just talk about, oh, just thinking about work gives me palpitations, or like,
Mm. Mm.
which is sad because you shouldn't be feeling palpitations thinking
Mm.
about work, but
Yep.
work is such. So
Yep.
how do you think we can manage this? Because at one point I think, especially in the pandemic, you
Mm.
either lose jobs or
Mm.
jobs just gets harder.
Right.
So
Right.
it's one of the two. So how can we manage that? Because of course job is not going to get any easier, but
Mm.
how can we
Mm.
manage our anxiety? Like, Sunday night you're already feeling
Mm.
anxiety
Mm.
about your
Yep.
Monday. Yeah.
Yep. Yep. And that's a fantastic question to ask, right? Because I think this is something that it's never going to go away, lah, right?
Mm,
Uh, a couple of minutes back, we were talking about that fight or flight response. Lah. We see a
right.
trigger, we see something that scares us, then we go into fight or flight. Now, for our caveman ancestors, when we see a bear or a tiger, we get a fight or flight mode, right? Few things can happen. One, we run away from the tiger. Two, we kill the tiger. Three, the tiger kills us. This is one thing will happen. One of these three things. But the
Yeah.
point is, the trigger of the anxiety or the stressor is gone, right? One way or another, it's gone, right?
True.
Fast
Mm,
forward to 2022, do we still have tigers? Yes. In Zoo Nagara, they're usually either sleeping or really tired and not moving around. So they're not the scariest thing in the world.
yeah.
What has become our triggers now is, like you said, like work, bosses, supervisors, and things like that. And those are people that you cannot run away from. You lose your job, which again another anxiety point, and
Yeah.
you can fight lah, but please don't lah. Then you get in jail lah. So don't lah, right? But that also means that our evolutionary methods of trying to get rid of sources of anxiety doesn't work anymore, right?
Yeah.
So
Mm,
that means we would technically like, or theoretically be in a perpetual state of stress because it doesn't go away. So what we can do is to change the way we react to the situation, and that's where the
mm,
whole therapy conversation comes in, right? If, like you said, just talking about work, just thinking of my boss, just having an image of my boss or the name of my boss flash on my phone means that I'm filled with anxiety, I have a panic attack, and that tells us that something really significant is going on, right?
mm,
And one of the best ways to go about doing that is to do this deep dive and find out how come, what about that boss triggers so much in you, or what about your job that triggers so much in you, that potentially we could change and tweak. Mm.
mm. I guess that's where the hard work comes in. A lot of people don't really think about, okay, this is something I really need to sit and reflect on and maybe write down.
Yeah.
People straight away just think, oh, it's just anxiety and I'm going to feel it for the rest of my life instead of trying to do
Mm.
something about it.
Yeah, yeah.
Because now it's normal. That's how it is. Work is supposed to
Mm.
be stressful
Yeah,
and things like
but I think
that.
that it goes both ways as well. So, like you said, some
Mm,
people get so used to anxiety that they thrive in an anxiety-filled environment, right? But the flip side can be true as well. People are so adverse towards anxiety that anything that anxiety provoking, they run away, right? Which also is
right.
not good because it's not practical. Because there's no such thing
Mm,
as never be anxious anymore. It's not viable in that sense.
right.
So you got to find that sweet middle ground line in that sense, like the sweet spot, which is not
Mm,
easy to do. We can.
yeah. Okay. So I think as last words, Dr.
Mm.
Joel, like for people who are watching right now, I guess people who are watching could be anywhere between 18 to probably my age, like millennials. So if you
Mm.
have any words, especially, in this pandemic,
Mm.
things are not yet getting normal. In fact,
Yep.
there's constantly new news, new updates
Mm. Mm.
about, there might be the cases are surging again, and there might be, there's a spike in cases again. So people are tired as
Mm.
well.
Yeah.
They have this pandemic fatigue they call. And then I don't know if people can ever be normal again. Can we ever go
Mm.
out without a mask again?
Yep.
So what would be your advice for people to navigate in these times?
Mm. So specific to this situation that you're describing, oh, sorry, fireworks. I don't know if you can hear that. Can you hear
Yes, I
that?
can hear that.
Sorry.
No worries.
Give it a moment. Okay, cool. It's gone. All right. Sorry, guys. Chinese New Year. Right. So I think that's a really good question to ask. I think a lot of times the anxiety that, by and large, due to COVID, due to pandemic, that we feel is
Mhm,
because we still hold on to the idea of the old normal, what we used to have, what life used to be, and things like that. And as human beings, we don't necessarily like too much change. And this was a big, big
mhm,
change, right? And we're very
mhm,
appalled for a lot of us. And I think the harder we hold on to those past memories, those past incidences, like, going to the mama at 11 o'clock and have a shisha, no problem, can. Now, no, cannot, right?
yeah.
And the harder we hold on to it and we long for that, I think that will cause people to be very distressed and upset, and sometimes very anxious as well, right? So I think not to, or trying to manage your anticipation, trying to manage your expectations, trying to manage your desire for things to go back to the old ways or a different way, for example, can go a very long way to helping you manage the anxiety and the stresses that you feel, right? I think there is a lot to be said for people who are able to go with the flow, who are a bit more chilled out and relaxed. And you find that they're a lot more less prone to anxiety because they will then, instead of anticipate, they react, right? Because
Mm,
sometimes we think about the worst case scenarios. For example, I'm going to exaggerate here. If I go out to work and I go on the LRT, I'm going to get COVID. Feasible, can happen, likely, but what's the chance of it happening? Not very high, right? So if you go out 9 times out of 10 times and nothing happens to you, is it worth all the anxiety and fear? Maybe not.
mm, yeah.
So when we are able to realign those expectations, realign those possibilities that we have in our head, and tell ourselves, hey, I might get it, and it's so viral nowadays. I'm probably gonna get it. When I get it, I'm gonna manage it. I've got my booster shots. I'm taking care of myself. I've got my mask on and things like that.
Mm,
Let's if and when I do get it, I'll deal with it. Right? If I don't,
mm,
yeah, it's fine. Let's move on. And if you can have that kind of a frame of mind, I suppose, I think it will do a lot of
mm-hmm.
good to manage anxiety.
Right. Thank you so much, Dr. Joel. I think we can
No
wrap
worries.
up with that wonderful words of yours. I guess people really need to take care of that. I don't know if you've heard of this Stoic teaching, and I guess that
Hmm.
really goes in line with what you've just said, which is basically do not get stressed out on things that's out of your control.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
There's
yeah.
a crude version to that, right? Don't stress the small things,
Mm,
uh, and deal with the big things or something along those lines. Like, yeah, yeah, exactly right, exactly right.
yeah. Thank you so much.
No
Advance
worries.
New Year wishes to you.
Thank you, much appreciated.
Thank you. Good night.
Right. See ya. Bye bye. Have a good one.
Bye. Okay, so thank you all for tuning in tonight. And for those of you who may have joined a little bit late, all the episodes and tonight's will be on BKNR Resources YouTube channel and Spotify. So thank you. Have a good weekend and good night.